Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 21st paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Peculiarity of Mind. The text follows. The peculiar characteristics of mind in the chief actor have, as well as those of the feelings, a high importance. From an imaginative, flightly inexperienced head, and from a calm, sagacious understanding, different things are to be expected. Now, as you understand, we will mostly consider philosophically this phrase as objectively all the Vom Kriege can be interpreted largely. This is not just a work on war as we understand, but on a lot of other things, as you have probably realized by now if you have followed the series just from, maybe one video. And in here von Clausewitz is stressing fundamentally the most peculiar of the so-called moral forces, that is effectively the individual's one, right? If you really want to get down to the minimal thing, even one single mind, like the one of a commander, for example, that has so much responsibility, but even the one of maybe someone who doesn't even pass to history with a name, but that is equally capable of doing very important and things that have important consequences in the overall picture, is one of those factors that a positive theory of the art of war, simply based on a sort of scientific calculation of what all the material factors of war could be, and puts in crisis, right? Even the actions of a single individual, his particular temperament and behavior can have an enormous impact in the history of mankind. And how can you how can you reduce that to a quantifiable variable, right? If you were to take Napoleon as an individual, how can you frame it into a theory of the art of war by saying, we can fundamentally calculate what this commander's talent has been historically speaking, and it doesn't matter, right? And this is when you start to get acquainted to this, and you realize that all those material calculations of how things could go are basically meaningless. You shouldn't be surprised, because after all, our society already largely recognizes this in some way. Now, it's interesting because naturally, even within, the Western world, there are many swings. Like, there are certain countries that are kind of more materialist oriented, others that are more idealist, and there are pro and cons at the same time. And yet von Clausewitz here makes us understand that objectively, and not just to stress kind of the opposite side of the story that it often gets mistaken, but making a pretty realistic assessment that we are humans, and as humans we know how complicated and unpredictable we can be. It is true that many of our behaviors are predictable in the sense that they are framed within a statistically known pattern of behavior in front of certain situations, but the situations vary constantly, and our reaction so does. So yeah, you can get kind of a scientific benefit from realizing more or less what what impact certain personality or psychological type can have. There are such categorizations. In fact, von Clausewitz here makes them too, right? But at the same time, the thing is still extremely susceptible to change, and to frame this in a kind of a positive prediction of what will happen is nonsense, right? It's dangerous, and it doesn't take into consideration, in fact, the reality of nature, right? And which is the only thing that matters, right? Always remember that this work is not interested in abstractions. It's not interested in things that this author believes or presumes or opinates, right? This is literally what you get in real life without any interpretation, right? There is a very, actually, and it's paradoxical, there's a very sound scientific approach to the whole story to realize what is, in fact, a scientific evidence that we don't have any system, any intelligence that can predict fundamentally what the future will be in politics, in society, in war. There is not. The myth that artificial intelligence can at one point solve such problems doesn't find any evidence. Artificial intelligence doesn't do that. It only works by exploiting certain patterns that you give it to it. But there is no way at this moment in history, and there will never be, fundamentally, anything that will get even close to the complexity of what human mind is. And we know this simply because we don't understand basically anything about how we work. Yeah, sure, we know a lot of things about our brain and whatever, but that much that we know is telling us that we still don't know a good damn nothing about it. And it's a sort of mystery, of course, but at the same time, it's still what the whole problem of situation is. How can you fundamentally try to predict what human groups will do if you don't even know how their brains work? That already should tell you, and you would say, well, but there are other ways. Yes, and what von Clausewitz makes you understand in this sense that by approximation you can achieve a certain result. You can approximately expect certain reactions, and in part predicting them, but never completely, and especially not even by large, not even by more than a half. And probably much less. We can't think of just a 1/4 maybe, right? And everything is relative. Of course, the more you know, even scientifically, materially about it, the more that helps you, right? Remember, it's the same von Clausewitz that says, if we really were to know everything in rational terms, not only we would predict essentially every single thing that happens, but we basically wouldn't even need to have a society, to have a life. Everything would freeze. We would all die at that moment as a consequence, because we would essentially eliminate that fog of war. We just passed me the analogy here. That is what makes our intellect dynamic, attracted, stimulated, and that's how we're biologically programmed in order to live in a world that effectively is a world that we do not know. You think that physics actually depicts what the world is? Of course it doesn't. There are no exact sciences of any sort. We don't know why we are here, what we are doing. We don't know whether reality exists or not. This is anything that science proclaims and is perfectly aware of. Nobody knows. But we have built these languages, we have built these interactions, because, you know what, they do work. Physics does work. Of course, mathematics does work, but at the same time, we have enormous problems to applicate this in real life, and especially to read the world in a way that is functional to our needs, right? So we have, of course, developed the sciences, we have developed many activities, but still, as tools, they remain, right? At the end of the day, if we don't know how to use them, and we don't know what it is, given that they are our creations, right, they are useless. What's the point of view to know what physics is if you don't even know how to speak or how to walk, right? That's a big deal. And it seems banal as an example, but it's actually not. So the peculiarity of mind is really what probably makes the real difference in the whole story, because every mind develops in its own way, right? We do have, of course, similar ways of doing it, but at the same time we brutally underestimate our potential. Right, we seem to be extremely intelligent to space, but actually our intelligence is pretty miserable compared to what it could be. And especially we drastically underestimate the possibility of change. This is called the end of history illusion. It's a very well-known scientific field of interest that is basically the tendency of human beings to think essentially that most of the changes in their life have occurred, that now they're simply going on in a kind of a stationary way without any significant change, or at least with minor changes that, however, they can still think to frame, to presume, to predict, right? And it's not like that, right? This is, of course, more typical of young people. Older people objectively do change less, but still we all, in different degrees, underestimate, enormously what we can do, what we're capable to do, and how easily we can adapt, right? So I think that this shouldn't lead maybe to morally relativistic attitudes towards life, in my opinion. There is in this sense enough evidence to show you, and this is what von Clausewitz is presenting you with, telling the truth, that all this big premise about the fact that we don't know doesn't quite mean that there is not the truth behind that. Meaning what? That, of course, you can come to doubt everything, and to be skeptical. That is, to effectively say, I can't know anything, so what should I do in the first place? Well, von Clausewitz, in this sense, uses a kind of a shock effect, just like I've done up to, since the beginning of the video right now, and as I often do when I speak about this topic, to explain von Clausewitz, because that's how objectively its consequences are the best, let's say, precondition of awareness and conscience to act in a world that we do know that works in a certain way, and we don't need to know why it does it, right? Or better, at one point we do constantly need to know that, but what von Clausewitz is telling you is that up to a certain point this question doesn't make sense, or at least you shouldn't focus your efforts so much on that, because if you were to analyze everything in detail, first of all, you should even come as far as questioning world knowledge, world awareness. And secondly, if you want to use the so-called exact sciences, you have to come to a realization that in order to investigate this world, even if they do work, you do need a lot of other things than just them as a tool in order to understand this world. First of all, because you don't have time. You don't have time to calculate anything. You don't have enough resources to calculate everything, right? When you, I don't know, take a motorcycle, you start, you switch engine on, you start driving. What are you doing at that point? Are you calculating like every kind of roads, mantle imperfection, or what the wind is like? You just go, right? You don't pose yourself to many problems, even if you know that's actually dangerous, and that are also, that is not easy to, to go out there thinking about everything that can theoretically happen, but you just do it, right? And this is what von Clausewitz is telling you, and this is how war and many other things in our society, in politics, actually happen, right? We don't know whether we're telling the truth or not. We all have opinions, we all have beliefs, we all have our way of looking at the world, but at the same time we make it go anyway, in spite of these opinions, these perceptions being approximated, and most of the time even wrong, right? So that's how far von Clausewitz actually gets, because I don't think in the work he ever kind of explains it more in detail, but you realize that most of these von Clausewitz videos end up in assessing this realization. Because that's the best way in order to make you understand, however, how, just to come back to the example of the motorcycle, how that motorcycle, however, goes. And von Clausewitz in this work, he explains you how that goes, right? Even without calculating every single molecule that intervenes at that moment, physically speaking, because that's not important. You don't have time to use it. So he just tells you what you have to do in the measure you have to deal with those problems by yourself, right? And naturally, war is kind of the most dangerous and unpredictable of all the human activities, right? And this is what von Clausewitz points out, and that's why this point becomes so meaningful here, because there is objectively a scale, even a measurable scale. If we were to draw the systems, mathematically, we would realize that. But the point is that in fact, you can't solve those systems, mathematically speaking, because at every moment you don't know 3/4 what the system is really about. That's the biggest problem. That's really the biggest problem. And just think about visualizing it. In fact, in an expression like in. It's a great problem. So this peculiarity of mind, von Clausewitz writes, the peculiar characteristics of mind in the chief actor have, as well as those of the feelings, a high importance. Right? And here he is talking, in fact, and that's why before we made that example, principally speaking, but it can be also for other less important people, about this chief actor that is essentially the military commander, possibly of the highest order, of the highest rank, right? So we're talking about commanders-in-chief and people who have to take the most important decisions when it comes to warfare. And that will condition heavily all the rest. And if you remember, in the previous paragraph, we have explained why, in the case of this so-called chief actors, even the most shaded aspects of their personality are important, because they come to influence a system that is much larger than all the others, because these guys are the top of everyone. So all these various personalities, features, maybe are not so important in a soldier, that at the end of the day gets pretty much flattened into the practice of soldiery. That is what von Clausewitz says also in the previous paragraph, saying that's probably paradoxically also one of the advantages of being a soldier. Yeah, that you're in front of the enemy, but at the same time you don't have to think to overthink. Like the combat becomes somewhat mechanical at one point, and it does become mechanical also in there, not because it's a simple business, but because there is a practice that you have to develop at one point, rather than starting calculating everything from the ballistics of each bullet, from the trajectory, of each bullet on the base of ballistics and everything. You don't think about that. You just are there. You take those shots, hoping not to get hit, and you just shoot back. Right? That's more or less it. And then, of course, being a soldier is not easy, and it does require a lot of intelligence in itself. But whether a person is shy or romantic or, I don't know, extroverted, well, at that point doesn't quite matter. When you're talking about a general, that does matter a lot, and I mean really a lot, right? Because all those characters of his can have an impact that on the field can mean 2,000 of those soldiers dead, and this is literally what happens. And it's never to be forgotten. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody's wrong. Also, great generals are not generals who don't make mistakes, but there are those who make maybe less mistakes than the others, and yet they have large enough shoulders, metaphorically, to to recover from that situation and carrying on, right? And that's why, in fact, von Clausewitz makes this list of qualities. Let's say he says, from an imaginative, flighty, inexperienced head, and from a calm, sagacious understanding, different things are to be expected, right? So, by turning them down, so it's the first type of guy that is kind of the here it doesn't say a stupid person, right? He says imaginative, right? That is kind of even positive, at least in our common sympathy. Like an imaginative person, can be a bit lazy, to be lost with his head in clouds, but still somewhat positive. But flighty, inexperienced, definitely start becoming something different, right? So maybe imaginative in here, telling the truth, can be translated better from the German, like immature, really. So imaginative, not in the sense that you have such a beautiful imagination, you can even predict things through your visual idea of what is going on, but imaginative in the sense that you just speculate. And that's the worst, right? And at one point we have already read it. Von Clausewitz writes something like that. That's the worst. Like, if you were to be lost just in theoretical speculations in war, you're done for, right? That's not what we need, and that's why we don't need a general who presumes that war is possible to be won. Just starting to calculate, every inch of the battlefield without considering moral forces, for example. Instead, this immature, overly excited, and fantastic person is probably not going to be very well, right? You need to be somewhat experienced. Like, you have to be imaginative, maybe in the sense you have to be concretely aware what you can expect. So you must have also the ability of maybe foreseeing certain things and having a capability of seeing, of farsightedness in a broad sense, but definitely not trying to generate pictures that just emerge from what your arbitrum is, right? This is very important, and that's what I think we will mostly talk about today. That is how we generally approach military history, because this is not a problem. Always remember about the Vom Kriege, this is not. First of all, this work had an enormous success among civilians, right? And this already tells you a lot about this book. And the concept here is, this is not just to understand war for someone who has to command men on the field. This is about understanding war more broadly. And naturally, military historians have to do this as well, whether they have a military experience like von Clausewitz had or not. Von Clausewitz was a military historian. Always remember this. Von Clausewitz was one of the greatest military historians of his time. He wrote a lot, he read a lot, he studied a lot from old military history, and that's what you should also do if you really want to be a military historian. It doesn't exist that a military historian studies just, just medieval warfare, right? And I'm a medievalist. I can't say that. No, you basically can't understand history in that way. If you want to understand the 100 Years' War, you have to have studied the Peloponnesian War, as much as if you want to understand, the wars of Italy, you have to have studied World War I, and vice versa in every case. Everything helps and everything is important, and military history has this diachronical dimension that we continue to neglect too often. Right, when it takes military history as just a series of chunks that you can analyze. In fact, theoretically, right, a great problem that we have in narrating military history today is cutting it in two chunks, right? Saying this battle isolated from every context, this campaign isolated from any context, this military development isolated from any context, and or as if it was just about proper of a certain army or polity or military culture, as if that didn't receive any influence for anything, right? And I realized that for didactical sake, it's very easy to do that, but it's incidentally why, for example, when I make military history videos, and every kind of video, at this point, telling the truth, I talk so much and about so many different things. I mean, I've been told, how much could you ever speak about, I don't know, a single battle, right? And you could talk even entire days about a single battle, because if you really go into the document, if you're lucky, even a few sources can complicate the picture very widely. So what military history does in here is actually showing you the degree of undecipherable complexity of certain historical events. So at the point that, especially in certain circumstances, far away episodes in time, we have even to surrender to the possibility that things might have gone in quite different ways from the ones that the story has told us. I mean, not history, but the story proper, right? What do we know about battle fought, I don't know, 500 years ago, if we weren't there? Of course, the more it's documented, the more it's likely that it actually happened in a certain way, but very often we don't know much, and sometimes even the most crucial aspects of it. So why do I say this? I say this because when it comes to military history, you can easily spot who doesn't display this method that is required, attached with other, personal qualities, right? And therefore, this imaginative head von Clausewitz speaks of here, projected on, who explains military history, is fundamentally, and we all have it in part. I'm not saying here, I don't have it. Like, we all have it. We all make that mistake by a certain degree, right? Is to picture maybe too much and starting to talk about things that probably do not matter in terms of what are the things that matter, right? Why do, for example, I have so much, I get so preachy and boring and rambling against anti-technologistic prejudice, against technologistic prejudices in an anti-technologistic sense, because we do have, many people have a lot of prejudices about, in this case of technology, for example, what's generally on the impact and the importance that actually has in warfare, right? I stopped the series of question and answers, also because I don't receive many questions about things I say. I don't know whether because I result completely incomprehensible, or just because I managed to satisfy every curiosity, which I doubt in the last case. But it's the combination. I mean, it's already from the patterns through which such curiosities emerge that you can't realize what. And now, without examples, it's difficult to actually specify that. But I don't know. Once I was asked, oh well, okay, like we're talking about von Clausewitz, not descent, because otherwise we start talking about Byzantine warfare, and I will not. We will not get out of here like a real von Clausewitz video, but I will make probably those question and answer videos again to show you methodologically at that point with certain specific examples what we're talking about in here, right? It's like, I don't know, I remember banal example, easier to easier to understand. Like when I was in high school, I don't know why, because at the time I wasn't like very authoritative, but nor I think that I'm still am today, historically speaking. But I don't know why my classmates thought I was somewhat, knowledgeable about war and history in general. And I was asked by one of my classmates. It was pretty intelligent, actually. I don't know why he posed me that question, because it was far more intelligent than that. He was looking at the map of Europe, and we were thinking in class. Like, he asked me, like, how is that the the German, the Axis forces invading the Soviet Union weren't simply, they went so deep and far into Soviet territory before being halted and rejected. Well, the Soviets could immediately take all that enormous Russian, throwing it against them. Now, it's a pretty stupid question, but that's the point of the thing. Like, that question was pretty imaginative. That is, it wasn't a question from someone who had his feet on the ground. Right, because now we don't enter into the technicalities of the Eastern Front during World War II, but you can easily understand, since it's a commonly known historical setting and event, that why that is wrong. What is the importance of strategy? What is important logistics? Pros and cons of Blitzkrieg, and also what the Soviets were organized like, and what were the actual industrial capabilities that there are lots of factors you have, and that's how you can answer a question. And the more of these factors you list, and you're able to connect correctly to the others, and the more you are, the more far you are from an imaginative situation, right? The same goes here with von Clausewitz when he says about a flighty head, overly excited head, right? That is a problem too, right? And it has to do sometimes with even ideological fanatism, right? Let's do something without actually caring whether it is true. This is something that is coming back as an attitude among lots of people. Like, it's easy to say young people, because usually young people are flighty and hot-headed and overly excited, etc. They're extremist. All young people are extremist in their own regard. And why? Because exactly because of the first point, I would say, because they're not experienced, because they haven't tested the validity of their beliefs, right? Everybody is able to understand something, a theory, an ideology, etc. Not everybody is capable of understanding whether that's actually accurate, productive, functional, and so on. And that's why it's so easy actually to find mature, but even old people will remain like children for all their life, because they keep believing nonsense, but I mean true nonsense, and being completely out of their mind, right? And we're full of these people, right? Just I think you all have not especially old people. I don't want to talk bad about old people. There are a lot of old people who are extremely intelligent, and they have this wisdom that is different from intelligence, right? Wisdom and intelligence are two very different things that, of course, know much more than you can hope, right? And it's always beautiful to meet those people, actually, because if you are healthy mind, you do realize that when the usefulness that they can have, and what they can tell you, and how far they have gone, right? Especially if in your life you have already gone a bit far, so you already know about the depth of this dimension, and you can assess that also what other people have come, right? Before it's all flat, right? And this flatness is, in a way or another, what the the war gamer that wants to reduce a war simulation only to a few rules actually creates, right? Instead of multiplicating the complexity of war, trying to narrow it down to certain dynamics that you calculate maybe in very irrealistic ways, or without taking into account certain interactions, etc. I don't have anything against war games. Actually, I think you can learn a freaking lot from serious war games about warfare, etc. They're very fascinating. War game can be everything, but I'm talking about the common commercial ones that I also never played, frankly. But I gave a read sometimes to their manuals. I mean, they're completely out of mind most of the cases, and why? Because of this. Because there is this idea that somewhat, you have to make, you can even make a small effort to try to understand something. And you can narrow it down to simpler things. And this is how the worst, even historiographically speaking, the worst mistakes have ever been achieved. Right? I spend most of my time in Schwerpunkt actually tearing down theories, ideas, and opinions that, historiographically speaking, have been debunked, right? And showing their, from one side, the simplicity of their assumptions, but at the same time showing, and this is paradoxical, sometimes reality in its much wider complexity can be interpreted actually in even simpler ways that are connected to that complexity, which is not, in fact, saying, which everybody also can do, oh no, things are more complex. Maoyautically speaking, you can even say, oh well, but it's more complex, let's take out something, let's try to deepen, right? Because everybody can do, like, that's something you can do with everyone. It's like when you're a child and you say, Mom, why is this thing like this? And your mother answers, you say, but why? And then she explains it and say, why? Saying why until, and you get the deepest secrets of the universe in like 5 and 6 steps, questions. But that doesn't quite help. I mean, it can help, of course, it should help, meaning that but this has to do also with the limits of historical research, of how that works, and on understanding the approximation and accepting the approximation. That is particularly important. Is understanding how far you can go, because let's be honest, if you, I don't know for you, but when I was little, I remember even when I was 4 or 5, I already thought about things like, I don't know, the infinity of the universe, of death, or of lots of things that I couldn't answer, and that's literally, in fact, what a child can do. Now, what a mature person can do instead is, of course, taking these two extremes, is starting understanding how far we can approximate our knowledge in the middle, and to our, for the sakes of our utility, right, of our usefulness, excuse me, of this knowledge, and that's what most of our serious adult stuff really lays within. Let's be honest about it. And on Schwerpunkt, unfortunately, I don't have the time to. I mean, many people like what I do, of course, because it's somewhat a bit deeper than the average you can find out here, which is absolutely not a great accomplishment, because it's literally, almost impossible to make worse than that. But what I mean is, I wish I could go way more in depth than this, right? Because problems are really complex, and every time I make a statement in here, especially when I discuss history, and I feel always challenged, because objectively, how can you tell history? Objectively, right? What is an exact science? I mean, as we were saying before, we can legitimately doubt even about mathematics. How can we doubt about history in the way it's told, right? And instead we do, and and the more we study history, we think we have and we do have objectively at that point a much sounder and solid understanding of it, and trying to orientate ourselves in, and that's quite a great accomplishment. Most of our time is actually spent trying to correct people who simply haven't gotten there, so they don't know what even the problem is. But even a serious historian is always telling not a lie, right? Because the truth lays within there somewhere, right? For sure, in part, etc. But still, everything that you say can be profitably criticized. And that's why we say it in the first place, because we do recognize that whatever thing we write, one day someone will kind of read it and say, okay, well, maybe this is surpassed, but at least that has helped that person to go beyond, or someone else for that person, because at that point, if he already knows that, well, yeah, but still for people to find out more, and this is what we do. And it's still also sad in part because there is a finite amount of knowledge, right? But it's not finite for everybody. This is the beauty instead of it. It's never finite for an individual's mind, right? What can make you sad is listening, maybe we have saturated that field of, that historical topic. It happens sometimes. There are certain topics about which nobody can add too much, too glamorous ones. It's different to find kind of virgin soil you can explore, saying, here I've discovered everything. In fact, that's what in research, academically speaking, everybody attention is directed, which I don't think it's even too healthy at this point, because it's becoming very commercial. Sometimes, like in my case, I like to study things that our people have already, they're fairly already known, but that maybe nobody had really seen from a certain perspective still. So that's because mind is quite tricky. We can be satisfied about a certain approach, but simply because we have never thought about another one. So the being excited and dogmatic and fanatic about certain positions is not really good, right? And that's why also, aside from flighty, which expresses it, von Clausewitz writes inexperienced, right, referring to this head. Experience naturally is everything. At this point, we don't have to explain experience, right? Because but we have to stress the fact that without this, you basically can't get anywhere, right? For example, I'm a pretty sensitive person. I do have, I think I take criticism decently enough. I do accept to be corrected, to be wrong, to be, with the due politeness. Everything is fine to me because I'm respectful towards other people as well, and instinctively, I think sensible people tend to close themselves, like to say, okay, I'm criticized, I close myself into my own shelter, and I don't want to hear anything. And this is getting insanely frequent, right? But if there is something I've learned, I think also the hard way, during, from quite some time at this point, is that without a confrontation with other people, you can't actually develop your own critical skills, which doesn't mean you have to argue with people. Sometimes you just can sit there and listen, right, and learn. But even, fighting, like trying to compete, trying to struggle, is important. And at one time, I will tell you, for example, why I got to make this videos on YouTube. Where do I come from in terms of comfort, like of being willing to put this stuff out here, and why, and with and you will realize that most of what I'm doing here is something I am able to do, and that I matured from my experience in other arenas, we can say, where I had to confrontate myself with other people. And of course, it wasn't particularly. I'm not an overly competitive person. I'm mostly competitive with myself, but that's a bit of a cliche as well. I mean that being competitive with yourself most of the times is being even unavoidably a bit too lenient, right? Because you do need a certain you need to throw your heart beyond the obstacle sometimes, and that's something you rarely do with yourself, unless you're not very motivated by some other reason, but it is often external, right? The tendency is to make it kind of easy and soft, and because also working under too much pressure, honestly, is not very good for the quality of work. So everything at a time. You need time to think, to realize, to absorb certain informations and to reflect about them. So it's not easy, but let's say that those experiences that I had were enough to make me understand a lot of things, and I wish I had understood more. Right, everything at a time. You don't have to run. You don't have to brutalize yourself in order to shock yourself, because a human mind is very delicate, right? Even if we don't want to acknowledge that, it's a very delicate system, right? Its balance is not easy to manage. So also a lot of this experience also entails learning how much you can take, in which doses, and with which frequency, and how to cope with that positively, right? With a positive outcome. And always bear in mind that however consumes your resources. Right? So it's not. And that's what von Clausewitz in fact talks about. There is this imaginative, flighty, inexperienced head, and then you have the other type that instead is calm, sagacious, and understanding. Right. So let's be. What is very interesting here. Excuse me. Calm, sagacious, understanding. Right. And by calm here, we could even say cold. And by understanding, and sagacious, you can even translate kind of vigorous. Right. So this. Thing is much like it's basically what the face of civilization is, right? And this has to do, in fact, if you remember the paragraph in which we're talking about the qualities of the mind, etc. And this is what you really need. You need someone with cold, right? Doesn't get heated up easily. That can therefore preserve its own moral and even physical resources, and to think, and to have this rational approach, this methodic, analytic approach to problems and how to solve them. So cold and vigorous. So, which means, you have to be kind of calm in the sense that you have to be mentally calm, but also you have to be willing to get through hell if it's necessary. So you need to be vigorous at the same time, because there is no you need motion. You can't think everything gets into this purely rational situation, because in war it's never like this. In war it's never rational, but in life it is never not even a half of rationality in what you do, right? Also, that one is an approximation. Rationality is mostly a tool that you use to stem your feelings and to direct them, maybe, towards a certain direction. That is the real problem. That is what really concerns and seems the most, you say, oh, we're done for because we're not rational. No, because we do build skyscrapers and we do fly planes, right? So we got somewhere with that, as and that isn't completely bad, right? You can trust these aspects of humanity. You can't find this kind of person within yourself at all times, right? Simply because you're a human. But it's not easy, and we don't all have this natural inclination. It takes a certain particular character, right? And it's somewhat an exclusive concept. It does take into consideration that certain personalities are not fit for achieving certain. But I think it's most a behavioral problem, right? It's something you can correct, at least over time. So if you've never been a disciplined person, if you don't know how to take your own responsibility, if you're a coward, if you can't take criticism, and you react in irrational ways, which is what we all do by a certain degree, no matter who we are, because every single human being in the world has instinctively these attitudes. Well, it's you can correct it, right? You can work on yourself to correct it, which doesn't mean you will ever get, change, become another person, because certain things, that especially there is a certain biological time, right? Things that happen in your childhood, in your teenage, in many other, they really mold your mind. You can't get rid of that simply by saying, oh, now I will discipline myself. If you've never been educated, like let's say better, you've never been disciplined, well, in your youth, right, in your childhood, well, chances are that it's very difficult for you to be disciplined in your life, for the rest of your life. But there is still something you can do about it. There is still a way to contain this and to understand why you're in a certain way. So we have this ability of correcting ourselves, and in correcting, if you wanted, the lower instincts that come to. And since war is mostly about moral forces, of course you have to take into consideration intelligence, but courage, determination, chiefly. So those are things you can train, right? Those are the single most important qualities of the mind for a commander, right? So it's all the more interesting that von Clausewitz makes these considerations, talking about the peculiarity of the mind, stressing, in fact, that there is an ideal, that is the cold, rational, and determined person, and then there is the peculiarity of the mind of every single individual, that no matter what context is present in, will react differently from the ideal. And it's kind of silly to hope to correct that at the theoretical level by saying, okay, when we think about war, we shouldn't take into consideration that there are these variations because those are subjective. No, those are not subjective. Those happen for real. They do influence reality because people will behave in those ways anyway. So if you really want to have a decent understanding of warfare and how things go, you can't take them out of the equation. You can't. Because otherwise you create an abstract system that has nothing to do with reality, and you will lose your war, at least more likely than you would do otherwise. And that's the real problem. That's when the real problem really begins. That's when we started going astray, pretending, and we keep doing it all the time as a civilization, thinking that it just takes a formula, it just takes a technology, right? Since before we were talking about technologistic prejudices, or a certain particular confidence and spirit to solve this big problem of reality. It doesn't work that way, and the best thing you can do is to recognize your limit first of all. But these are things that are widely known, even in philosophy of science. I mean, this is not just von Clausewitz realizing it. He was writing these things, of course, in moments in which there were other great thinkers. Thinking about Kant, thinking about Fichte, or I don't know, there's plenty of Feuerbach. You know, then would come Hegel, of course, but I mean, he was, of course, also von Clausewitz's contemporary, but I mean, these were important times in the definition of limits more than else. That's what Kant telling you the truth. He tells you, you know, you can, and von Clausewitz is heavily influenced by Kant's philosophy, you know, that we have to accept that we have limits, but still we don't have to cry on ourselves. We have to realize that within those limits we can do our impossible, right? And it's from realization, you're already, you know, drawing this fence that we can understand, in fact, what pertains the most to us, because most of these limits are not strictly material, but they're also a question of disciplining your moral forces, including understanding, including intelligence, including the way you should approach certain topics, and that's the big deal, right? And that's, I think, the single most important thing to consider. All right, so yeah, this is more or less von Clausewitz idea about this. This was just an example, but as you understand, every single word by von Clausewitz is not anecdotal here. From these three, like 2 and not even half lines, we managed to extrapolate a lot, right, about lots of things, including war, military history, etc., that are more than just an ideal. All this is aimed at dealing with war in the first place, whether you have to participate to it, to command, or maybe as a citizen that has to vote for certain decisions relatively to it, or as a military historian in order to try to understand a certain military event that happened. So it's very thought-provoking, right? And I fundamentally believe that if these things were taught regularly, I could say even in schools, right? Even, you know, synthesizing von Clausewitz in his thought, and not just being an unknown thinker of sort that appears here for who knows which reason, but as, you know, really a lighthouse, as a point of reference. Well, the whole thing would be very, very different. We would try to you know, probably to change a lot of our problems, like to make clarity, to organize better our thinking, and to obtain far more results, essentially by doing nothing but having a bit our road a bit more clarified. This is the key of the story. It's not about us being told which path we have to take, but just having a bit more light on the path that we undertake, that we start. Right? That's probably the single most important thing. And I don't think that there are healthier ways to do this. And the more times passes, and honestly, the more I sympathize with this thinking, because these are thoughts and topics that also many historians objectively ignore. Right? I don't know what historians do. Like, I have now this very peculiar path of mind, and I decided from some year fundamentally to just dedicate me myself fully to learning. Like, aside from strictly my path that I have with my research and whatever it will lead me to, but kind of deepening also these other topics, like not becoming a simple, specialist worker that researches about that specific time and space and then ends the thing there. Because I think everybody's able to do something like that. Of course, you should have a bit more critical thinking, but still, probably, you should also expand your thinking. You should be start thinking with your own head, which today is often is a phrase that is often instrumentalized to either stop thinking with your own head, or maybe getting too dogmatic, that is enclosing yourself into something that doesn't work. Well, the concept is completely its opposite, and whichever thing you want to believe in, actually you make a much better, you render much better service to yourself if you open this, because whatever you want to learn is much more easily comprehended in this way, which is often which is often forgotten as well. So I personally advise you really to expand your know. Then I don't know, maybe who studies philosophy already knows these things. I have all my prejudices towards philosophy students. No, I'm kidding. Of course, I don't have anything about that. But it's like, asking a historian, what I think about philosophy. Philosophers, it's like, like cats and dogs. Like with historians, with archaeologists, like even if we are the same people technically, or at least we should be, but unfortunately it's not the case because we have a different education. But yeah, there are these, and this is what I would like to make you understand. This probably goes beyond. Like, I can't assure you cent for cent that you can't hear this thinking from someone who has a kind of a different attitude. But I can tell you that who studies military history, in my opinion, has, and I can't see it clearly, a much more rational and anti-dogmatic approach to reality than other people, which has nothing to do with the personal beliefs of this person, in the sense of, there is a much greater clarity and order and separation of certain things that help a lot to the general understanding, which could be very profitable if we really understood it as a society, and that's what I'm talking about fundamentally. All right, so I think we stop here, and all right, so we will go on. I don't know what this list of paragraphs ends, because maybe in the future we'll soon. In a few days we'll have kind of a longer paragraphs. Finally, we speed up a little bit with here, because we are going very slow, as you understood here with the Vom Kriege. As this, I'm making a video for each paragraph here, and these paragraphs are very, very short. And as you understand, I talk to you about other things that, but eventually paragraphs will become enormous. Like, so we will have to speed up a little bit, and whatever, we will do it. It's not a big deal, as long as we get von Clausewitz right, which is the most important thing. Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.